All right, so today we're going to tackle a question that comes up a lot. What's the difference between emulators and simulators? And when would you actually use one versus the other? So let's get right into it and break this down with a few practical examples. Before we do that, let's do a quick recap on what the definition of an emulator versus a simulator is. So, emulators are like virtual copies of mobile hardware. They mimic both the hardware and the real operating system. So this means that when you test your app on an emulator, you're using the actual operating system image just as you would on a real device. So, for example, if you want to see how your app behaves under low memory conditions, an emulator can simulate that scenario accurately. Examples of commonly used emulators in the market are the Android Studio emulator, which is the official Android emulator that comes with Android Studio. It's feature rich and supports various Android versions and device configurations. Genymotion is a popular third party Android emulator known for its speed and other features. It's available in both free and paid versions and works on Windows, Mac, and Linux. And while primarily used for gaming with Android apps on PCs, BlueStacks is another tool that is also used for basic app testing. It's particularly useful for testing how apps perform on lower end Android devices. Simulators, on the other hand, create a virtual runtime environment. And for added context, a runtime environment is the stage where your application executes. It provides all the necessary pieces, such as the operating system, libraries, APIs, and configurations, to ensure your app runs properly, whether on a physical device or in a simulated control setting. So, simulators mimic the software side of a device, letting you see what your app looks like and how it behaves without replicating the actual hardware. This is great for testing things like screen layouts or different resolutions, but it means the app you run on a simulator isn't exactly the same as the one on a real device. Examples of commonly used simulators are Apple's iOS simulator that's built into Xcode, Apple's development toolkit. You've probably used browser simulators like Google Chrome's device mode or Firefox's responsive design mode that let you simulate how your app looks on different mobile device widths. In addition to simulator or emulator specific tools, you can also use cloud based tools such as Lambda tests and Browser Stack that provide numerous simulator and emulator options for testing. Now let's look at some practical testing examples to see how these tools come into play. The first we'll look at is user interface testing. So imagine you're developing a mobile shopping app and you need to ensure that the app's interface adapts well to various screen sizes, from a small phone to a large tablet. A simulator will be a good tool to use here because it can quickly show how the layouts adjust, helping your team learn where to fine tune the design without worrying about the hardware specific behaviors. In another example, let's say we want to do hardware dependent testing. Think about a scenario where an app you're testing needs to handle a sudden drop in available memory. An emulator would be a good tool to use in this situation because an emulator can mirror the actual hardware. This allows you to test the app's stability under stress, something that you can't do easily with a simulator. Now let's look at a scenario where you might combine both tools for feature-specific testing. So let's consider a gaming app that relies on multi-touch gestures or accelerometer data. You can use a simulator to test the look and feel of the game. And if you want to replicate how multi-touch or motion sensors work, then an emulator will work in that scenario. Now, here's an important point to remember. Simulators and emulators have their place in testing, but they won't be able to provide the confidence like testing on a real device. So be sure to include a real device in your final validation before shipping apps to production. So, as a guideline on when to use each tool, use simulators for quick early stage testing, evaluating UI designs and screen resolutions, and running tests that don't depend on specific hardware features. Use emulators for testing scenarios that depend on hardware behavior, like low memory or battery conditions, as we mentioned. Verifying that your app behaves similarly to how it would on a real device. Checking interactions with the operating system's core features. And use real devices for final pre release verification and validation to capture real world performance and user experience. And generally, for any scenario where you determine that you can't get the same level of confidence testing on an emulator or simulator as you would on a real device. So hopefully this short video gives you a better idea of when to use emulators versus simulators. So thanks for tuning in and happy testing.